Welcome back. Welcome back. I'm the only doctor up here that has not gone to medical school. I am the doctor of reunion, reunining this weekend. Thank you. Wasn't that great with Professor Tucker? I'll tell you a story about that print. I spotted it in a gallery almost 5 years ago, just up the street from my daughter's apartment in Brooklyn, and I bought it instantly, and I said, I know exactly who's going to get that, and I know exactly when. So it would have been a shame for that thing to have gone to waste. And I had it framed, and I told the frame shop, I said, I want it to look like it just got stolen from the Musée d'Orsay. Anyway, thanks again for coming this weekend, and thanks for coming to these panels. Years ago I heard from some friends who had physician panels at their reunions and said they were well attended, especially because we tend to use more doctors' services at our age. And we have a great crop of physicians from our class, and they've often been too busy to come to reunions. I thought, we had a little art earlier this afternoon, and pre-med and medicine is mostly science. So I thought, let's switch gears and just have a little insight into some science, medical science. And who better than 5 of our physicians? I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then I'm going to ask each one of them to just spend a few minutes telling you about their medical careers briefly to set the stage. And then I've got some David Letterman-like questions for them. And, we'll try to explore a few topics. And I promised that we wouldn't get into nationalized health care unless a fight would break out between the economics majors and the political science majors. So we'll steer clear of that. Let's go just from the far end, Skip Durning.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Williamstown. I'm lucky enough to live here. After graduating from Williams, I went to medical school in Albany, then 3 years of residency in Seattle, Washington. My wife, Margie, decided that we wanted to come back east. And so we looked at New England college towns as a place to stay. We looked at Middlebury and Hanover and up in Maine, and then just happened to be picnicking on Coalfield. And I said, well, why don't we think about coming back here? And it just so happens that the local multi-specialty group practice was looking to increase their numbers. So I applied for the job, and I didn't get it. But I said, well, why don't we just go back anyway? And she said, what, are you crazy? That you don't have a job? I said, I have a medical license. Can't you just open an office and make it work? Well, I came back, and one doc retired, one doc had a gallbladder attack, and the flu hit, and I was busy ever since. So some of the amazing highlights, I had a primary care practice in the old-fashioned way where you did both hospital and office work for the first part of my career, and then transitioned along with HMO medicine and other managed care vehicles, and then in 2004 transitioned to become a hospitalist. So worked full-time in hospitals from 2004 until I retired in 2015. So it was there was a difference in the way you interacted with patients because they weren't, quote, yours anymore. But I was in a good place because most hospitalists, at least when I was doing it, were young docs who had finished their residency but hadn't figured out what they wanted to do with their lives. They were going to go on to specialty training, or they were going to do whatever. And I took it upon myself to teach them, or try to teach them, what helps primary care physicians when you finish with their patients in the hospital. How do you get them back to the doctors in the way that the patient's well served? And that's not something that residents think very much about. So that was a kind of a fun part of that practice. Retired in 2015, live here in Williamstown, and it's as magical to live here as it was to go to school here.
Saul Basta, welcome.
Hi, everybody, welcome. I'm kind of like the outlier, I think, in this group, because when I came to Williams, I had no thought whatsoever that I was going to become involved in medicine. I had some great mentors here. I was a chemistry major, and Bill Moomaw and Ray Chang and Hodge Markgraf were like my idols and mentors. And I fully expected that after I passed through Williams, I would go on to graduate school, and had the lofty ideas that I would like to do what they do and be a professor in chemistry at Williams if Williams would have me. I can't tell you if it was a stroke of lightning or whatever, that after 3 years of being here in Williamstown, that I changed all of my plans. And I decided that medicine is where I wanted to go, and I wanted to become involved in medical research. So I didn't have all the prerequisites, so my fourth year here, I took all science courses that I needed to fulfill that I didn't have. And I wrote my thesis. I went to another college to sit on their campus and in their library and write my thesis here before I went off to medical school. And I went to UMass Medical School in Worcester. I was in the third entering class at UMass. In the first class, there were 16 people. In the second class, 16 people. My class, there were 24 people, then 40 people, and now there's about 110 in each class. We had no hospital. We had one building that was a rental where we spent our first 2 years. They opened 40 beds at UMass Medical Center in my junior year. And that's where I got all of my training, and it was a wonderful place, and it still continues to be a wonderful place. And they are holding fast to the fact that what they really wanted to be mostly is a primary care institution. So I'm an outlier there too. So I did not, go ahead and do any of that. I spent my residency and fellowship at the Mass General Hospital. And I retired from the Mass General Hospital at the end of February 2029. 2029.
It just seems like it.
Yeah, it just seems like it. 2020, sorry. I'm a Gemini, and because I'm a Gemini, nothing really hangs on to me for much more than 2 or 3 or 4 or 7 years. So because of that, in anesthesia, I've done a number of things. After finishing my residency and fellowship, I was a part-time clinician and a part-time researcher, and was part of the neuromuscular group at the MGH, in which case we were looking to develop a series of drugs that are often used in surgery that have fewer side effects than curare and other drugs that are long-acting and sometimes difficult to reverse at the end of surgery. So I did that, and we ended up getting 4 drugs on the market. In those days, Harvard's rules and MGH's rules were, if you were the researcher, you couldn't participate in the revenues from those drugs. So patents are held by the MGH and the drug company. But that was okay because it was fun to do. And my group, headed by my mentor, John Savarese, who's now retired from being chief at Cornell Weiss Medical School, took chemical compounds and we evaluated them with how they worked in the patient, how quickly they had an onset of action, how quickly they recovered, did they have cardiovascular side effects, did they make you a blithering idiot when you woke up from them, did it make the monkeys mad when we were treating the monkeys with them, and all of those kinds of things. And we managed to develop medications that 4 of them are used in clinical practice. And we were also in competition, if you will, with a group, Organon Technica, which was also working to develop muscle relaxants. They were using different chemical compound than we were. We were using bis-isoquinoline esters, and the purpose was we would develop a drug that was metabolized by the same enzymes that metabolize acetylcholine in humans, or fell apart naturally on their own because they were programmed to fall apart at a certain period of time. And we were successful in that, and those drugs are used clinically today. After that, I got interested in OR administration and spent a few years doing OR administration in our hospital. And from there, I segued over to going over to the Mass Eye and Ear, and was chief of their anesthesia department for 5 years. And we managed to build a new operating room because the old operating room was tiny and old. And I told them that when I got there, I went down to OR 5, and I'd left one of my books in there when I was a resident, and it was still in the anesthesia machine. So it needed a little help. So we built a new OR, and one of the side benefits was adult patients came in on the 9th floor, pediatric patients came in on the 10th floor. They had to come down to the 5th floor in order to be pre-op and get prepared for the OR. Then they came in and went through the OR and then back up to their respective other floors. And we figured out that was about 50,000 elevator trips a year, more than was actually necessary if we had everybody on just 2 floors, pediatric floor and the adult floor. And it took a lot of convincing to do that, but in the course of the 5 years that we were convincing people that this is what we needed, they finally built it. So that was, from my perspective, a really great thing. After that, I went back to the MGH, and they were about to try an experiment. And that experiment was to take an academic medical center like MGH and integrate it into the community on the North Shore of Massachusetts, like North Shore Medical Center, which is Salem and a couple of other hospitals, and put a freestanding ambulatory care center not close to MGH and not close to Salem Hospital. And that was where I spent the last 11 years, and spent much of my time after we got started developing a quality assurance program that ultimately tries to get teams to work together. If you're an OR team that does only orthopedics, let's get you into an environment where we're going to do some simulations that were very lifelike and teach people how to work together as a team to do what needs to be done under extreme circumstances, that if something goes wrong in the operating room, how that team should be functioning in order to achieve a particular result. And that, in a nutshell, is what I did. And I retired, and have now been retired for a little over 2 years, and I'm still trying to find my way into retirement. So,
Well, you found your way here.
I found my way here, and I'm glad I did, because this is only the third reunion I've ever made it to, for lots of reasons. But if you have some good ideas, I'm open.
Dr. Bill Kehoe.
Hello, welcome everybody. Unlike Sal, I probably always wanted to be a doctor. My father was a pediatrician back in Iowa, and I came here as a pre-med and flirted briefly with something more interesting, but I couldn't do it. So anyway, so back to pre-med, and I left here and went to Loyola Stritch Medical School in Chicago, and graduated there in about 3.5 years, which was put us sort of out of sync with the residency program. So I did a 9-month pathology program where I did autopsies and surgical, handled surgical specimens for that period, and then went into my internal medicine residency at Rush. Stayed there for 3 years and signed on with a group of physicians there and have been there ever since. In 2007, I transitioned to a concierge medical practice, which I suspect most of you know what it is. I don't know if I need to describe that, but anyway, it was a very good move. At the time, I was getting burnt out. I had, I don't know, if you defined it as someone who I'd seen at least once in the last 2 years, somewhere on the order of 3,500 patients, and it was just crazy keeping all those balls in the air. And the idea behind concierge medicine is you cut down to no more than 600 patients and try to provide better, more attentive care to those 600. I like to say that I went from having 3,500 patients who thought they owned me and didn't, to having 600 who thought they owned me and did. Which is sort of, it keeps me close to home more than I'd like. I I don't take very many long vacations, a week or 10 days at the most. But it's resulted in my really enjoying medical practice, because it really is, for the first time in my career, it was, my interests and the patient's interests were really on the same page. They were interested in service. I was able to give them service, and when I didn't know what I was doing, I was able to find people that could help them out. So it became a pretty satisfying arrangement for all of us, and it's also provided a nice glide path to retirement, in the sense that I'm, down to like 390 patients now, and not too many people that want to sign up with a 72-year-old guy, and so it's most of them are. There's some attrition, shall we say. Anyway, no plans for retirement as yet, but who knows? Like Sal, I'm open to ideas, so that's my story.
Dr. Kevin Kelly.
Thanks. Like Sal, I had no idea when I started at Williams that I would end up going to medical school. Unlike Sal, that was still the case when I left Williams, or at least when I left the first time. I was a religion major at Williams. Paul Courtwright was my senior seminar instructor. My fantasy was I was going to go get a PhD and come back and join the faculty at Williams and get tenure and live happily ever after. After a short time in graduate school, it dawned on me that my fancied outcome was not inevitable and not even likely, because I saw people driving cabs around Chicago with their University of Chicago PhDs. So I thought I better rethink this plan, and I got a job in a psychiatric hospital. And after a short time there, decided this is really what I wanted to do. So I had to go back and do all those science courses that I hadn't done as an undergraduate, and this was before there was any such thing as an organized post-baccalaureate pre-med program, so I kind of patched my own together, including some courses here, and moved to New York 4 years after college to start medical school at Cornell, intending to put in my 4 years and get out of the city as quickly as possible. Ended up marrying a native New Yorker and raising 3 kids there, and bought the whole package. I'm still there. I stayed there for my internship and my residency in psychiatry and at Cornell, and my psychoanalytic training at Columbia, and then joined the voluntary faculty at both of those places, and for about 15 years was mostly in private practice and stealing a little time on the side for teaching and writing at those academic places. And then 9/11 happened, and after that I got involved in volunteering mental health services to the fire department, and that morphed over time from a volunteer thing to a part-time thing supported by a foundation, to what's called a full-time position with a commission as a medical officer. So I'm now officially a battalion chief in the FDNY, and spend about half my time, thank you. Spend about half my time doing that, and the other half still in private practice. As you can imagine, the fireman population is a little different from the Upper East Side private practice population. They're still in New York. They're first, second generation Irish and Italian Catholic working class guys from the outer boroughs, basically the people I went to grade school with. And we kind of lost touch with each other for a few decades, but it's kind of a little bit like coming home, so that's been nice. In my private practice these days is about the closest thing in modern medicine to a mom and pop candy store. You know, it's me and my chair and my couch and my answering machine. I still keep handwritten notes. I don't deal with insurance companies at all, which gives me the freedom to set my own fees so I can steal from the rich and give to the poor. And it's a lovely freedom. I don't expect to retire. Psychiatrists usually don't. You usually leave the office feet first. But either that'll happen or someone will tap me on the shoulder and tell me that I've become too demented to keep doing this, and then I'll try to make a graceful exit then.
I didn't know about the battalion chief thing. That's kind of cool. I'd have to introduce you to my grandkids. You get a hat, yeah.
And a parking placard.
And a parking pass? That's good. Good.
I do.
Dr. John Dyer.
Listening to Sal, I feel just as inferior now as I did in the chemistry building 50 years ago, watching him work. I went to University of Rochester Medical School, decided to go into family practice, and at the last minute changed my mind and went into internal medicine. I went to a small program affiliate of Columbia in Cooperstown, Basta Hospital. Considered doing a subspecialty, but had 1.5 children, medical school debt, and some other family responsibilities. So I returned home to a solo practice with 2 other associates. Learned more in my first year of solo practice than I did in all the years prior to that. And just to sort of shorten this up, I've practiced in a solo practice, 3-person entrepreneurial type practice where we owned the building, owned the x-ray and so forth and so on. I've practiced in a larger primary care practice and also finished up in a much larger multi-specialty practice. I've practiced in my hometown with the Glens Falls area. I practiced in Tucson for a number of years and wound up back in Cooperstown in this larger multi-specialty practice. But over the last 15 years or so, I just retired last June after a sort of a long, dwindling end of a career. But anyhow, the last 15 years or so, I did a lot of work with the internal medicine residency, and some administrative work. And I also precepted some Columbia students, and interestingly enough, some of them were Williams undergrads. So, anyhow.
Thanks a lot. You know, you weren't all classic pre-meds here at Williams, as you've just described. I had a roommate who was pre-med, and I think we have a slide of my roommate to show you. That is now Dr. Brad Harris, who unnerved me one evening when I came in after a party, and it's like midnight, and he's assembling a cat skeleton and disassembling it, and first words out of my mouth were, "Whose cat is that?" and that's when I realized that he was on a different trajectory than I was. And luckily, I never had to walk in when he was working on some larger form of mammal. But you know, that just became, it startled me that was going to become just sort of one of his experiences was, you know, knee bone connected to the thigh bone and all that other stuff. When you guys get to medical school finally, and Kevin, you arrived a little differently, you know, how did your pre-med experience here, if it was classic or otherwise, prepare you for medical school, just academically? Did you find that you were in good shape, or did you find that, you know, you had to work just as hard? Kevin?
I would say that it prepared me very badly for medical school because the teaching here was really good. And I got spoiled, and I thought that that's what medical school was going to be like. And it was dreadful. They were terrible teaching and infantilizing, intellectual, stultifying experience. Fortunately, residency was a whole different thing, and analytic training was a whole different thing, but medical school was awful, and Williams did nothing to prepare me for that.
John, any thoughts on that?
I grew up in a very small town. My grandfather was the town doctor, so that was, at least my family always thought I was going to go into medicine. So at my father's urging, before I decided to go into medicine, I asked my grandfather, you know, what should I take? What should I do? And he said, well, you really should consider 3 things. He said, 1, shorthand. Take shorthand if you're going to go into medical school. I said, I don't think they have that at Williams, but I'll check. And he said, take Latin, which I didn't do. That's, in his time, that really helped with writing prescriptions and so forth. And finally, he said, and he had gone to McGill, he said, take every every course you can possibly take that has nothing to do with medicine or science. And I really tried to do that here. And even though we talk about this being the science part, I'm just a humble general internist, and an awful lot of what I did and we do is not very much science and an awful lot of social science. So I was very happy to be here and was delighted I could do a lot of things outside of the science tract.
Skip, any thoughts along those lines?
The things that helped me the most in medical school from Williams, like John, were the non-science courses. Those were foundational, and they taught you how to study and how to think. But the confidence that I personally get, I came into Williams and was immediately blown away by the people I was surrounded by. I tried to, I played freshman football and sat on the bench and watched all these athletes. And I went to labs and I watched all these smart guys. And I felt like I was really treading water, that I was totally over my head. But over the next 3.5 years, a couple of people kept reminding me, somebody thought you were okay to come here. Now just prove it. And I gained so much confidence in myself, stimulated by still the smartest people I ever came into contact with were classmates and colleagues here at college. So that when I got to medical school, I was confident that I could do it. It was a volume of work. I wasn't worried about, that I wasn't going to be able to keep up or do anything like that. As opposed to Kevin, my thought about medical school was it was like double sessions before a sports team. You had to slog through that stuff so that you could play the games. And I thought of medical school as a means to being a doctor. And I really wanted to be a doctor. And that's how it worked for me.
Saul?
I'm really interested in what you just said, quite honestly, because when I went from here to my medical school and in the basic sciences that they were trying to teach us, it was mostly lectures, labs, no problem solving necessarily, just you have to master X amount of knowledge or you're going to be lost forever. And that was kind of still lost on me. I thought you could do both of those things. And I didn't get very much of that in the first 2 years of medical school. Finally, when we started doing some clinical things, I was fortunate to come across some physicians there who were not really used to teaching because it was a brand new medical school and they were mostly clinicians, that changed my mind, that there's a lot of stuff you need to think about other than, quote, the facts. And that was a revelation to me because I from my previous background and the kinds of things I enjoyed, it's like when people started talking about COVID-19, it's the science. Well, for me, in the beginning, it was all about the science. And you don't really learn. My biggest quandary, and when I first went and did my internship and residency, until I became a staff person, I still didn't really completely understand what it's like to be a doctor, to have true responsibility for people's lives. And they say, oh, you're an anesthesiologist, but boy, all people who are doctors and take care of patients, at some point in time, you have to face the fact that every person that you see, every person that you treat, every person that you formulate an anesthesia plan is different. It's important. You've got to understand everything that goes into taking care of that patient. Preoperatively, what are their fears? Most people probably don't know what anesthesiologists do, and maybe that's good. But, because I could tell you stories.
They wake you up, that's the key.
Sometimes, that's the expensive part, just to let you know. But, everybody that comes to an anesthetic is probably a little bit nervous about what's going to happen to them because it's such a black hole to them. Nobody knows what's going on. Parents of children are exceptionally anxious about their child having to go under an anesthetic because they have kind of lost complete control. Once you get into that room, they're not there anymore, and they don't know what's happening to their child. So you have to have ways of allaying the child's feelings, making the parents comfortable with what you're going to be doing, other than having the surgery. So those are the kinds of things that I didn't really get or didn't really appreciate in medical school until I actually got to practicing and having patients that I was responsible for. And in the beginning, I really felt that to be almost a crushing burden. And it took a while to get over all of that. And I was probably practicing as a staff person and teaching residents how to do anesthesia for maybe 2 or 3 years before I became comfortable with the idea that what happens in this room is dependent on the surgeon, the nurses that are working in there, the person that's giving the gas or the epidural or the nerve block, to make sure that this person comes out no worse than when they went in. And it took me a while to figure that out.
Dr. Bill.
Just, excuse me, one observation was that, I mean, even in something as rigid as a pre-med program, I think at Williams we were led to believe, led or encouraged to go on our own individual route and find our own way and take the courses that interest us, et cetera. I mean, they really wanted us seem to be to all be individuals as we left. Med school, on the other hand, was the complete opposite, I think. I mean, that was a 3-year experience where they sort of wanted us to all be the same at the end. I mean, the same level of knowledge, different interests perhaps, but we needed a certain basic level of knowledge of certain things. It was just a different experience than the Williams experience.
I will say that I think medical education these days is much better than it was when we were going through it, and that's not just because I'm on the faculty now. But a few years ago, our son started medical school at the University of Pennsylvania, and during the orientation for students and families, the dean, who was about our age, came out on stage with a pile of books as tall as himself. And he said, when we were in medical school, your job was to memorize all the information that's in all of these books over the course of 4 years. Now there's 100 times that much information, and it all fits on this little device, which we give the students in the first week of school. It's no longer about memorizing, it's about figuring out how to use information, and I think that's much better.
It's interesting. Bill and I were in a golf cart yesterday, and when we weren't hitting slices and hooks, I asked him the question. I said, you're in a licensed profession, and lawyers are used to this, other professions are. Most of us did not go into licensed professions, and you have a CME, continuing medical education component of your profession that goes on, and most of us don't have that. We don't have that as a requirement that we keep going. Bill, maybe you could give your thoughts on that, and it's keeping up, which is maybe similar to what Kevin's talking about, how to keep getting information as you're going along in your career.
He's always expanding, and there's a real tendency to get develop some tunnel vision in medicine. I mean, you find certain things that work for you, and you just keep drilling those, and you just got to keep reminding yourself there are other options available, other diagnostic options, other therapeutic options, and it's CME helps to encourage that, but it becomes sort of a minimalist requirement that we probably really need to go beyond more. But the government sets a sort of a basic certain number of hours you got to do, and you get that done, and hopefully that's not the end of it.
Kevin, CME in your field?
Maybe I have a jaded view because I spend a lot of my time in an academic institution. So the CME requirement is mostly a paperwork requirement. It's documenting that you're doing stuff that you would be doing anyway. And a lot of it ends up being a way of making travel deductible because you had to go to things as a conference. But it doesn't have a whole lot of effect on my life otherwise.
John, how did you use or
Well, there are two forms of CME. Basically, one is when you travel and enjoy the travel and have a tax benefit, which is wrapped up in that. There are meetings that you go to. Again, with medical education, we would go to a variety of different meetings, but basically there you were dealing with people who were dealing with the same problems you were. That was real work. That wasn't fun, but still, I think that I don't think anybody has proven that CME of any kind changes behavior or changes outcomes. So in the larger sense, it's a business. For me, when I was, I won't say the age, but around 2000, I was feeling I was getting burnt out. I was working in an extremely busy practice, a lot of hospital work, a lot of call. And like Bill said, that you develop these patterns that work, you do them over and over again, you stop thinking and just try to get the day completed. So that's when I decided to go back to a more academic environment and do some teaching. So for me, the CME really, if you're involved with students, residents, peer teaching, doesn't matter. If you're doing teaching, that is the best CME I think you can do.
Saul?
I think in a field that's probably 50% technical in anesthesia, as well as everything else that goes into it, CMEs has been very important. Partly because when I sit around and just kind of think about where I started in anesthesia and when I left anesthesia, what it was like, it's almost like a different profession now. It changed so much in the past 40 years. And I would say that if you go into the mid-teens, it's probably doubled in terms of its knowledge on every sphere you can go into. So CME is critical for anesthesia. And going through seminars, going through education sessions, talking to people in your own department, having medical grand rounds, and all of this sort of stuff for anesthesia is quite important. If you're practicing 30-year-old anesthesia, you're doing it wrong, kind of thing. If you're practicing 15 years ago, you might be doing it wrong. Because not only have the drugs gotten better, but they're still not perfect. The technology has gotten to such a point that you have to figure out some way to master it. I mean, and you can master it in some ways, as they're finding out now, is that everybody's a little bit different. They don't all respond to this one drug the same way. People genetically have built-in mechanisms to do something good with the drug, and some other people don't do so well with the drug. And that's to the point that we're starting to get now, that with genomics and a lot of other stuff, we're starting to realize that maybe in another 10 or 15 years, for everybody out in this audience, they might have a different anesthetic applied to them because their body is different and they handle drugs in different ways. So CME is very helpful in this particular area to addressing that issue. The other thing that it addresses the issues are that the thing that
Microphone.
The thing that has gotten very good is the fact that it's finally not just the surgeon as the captain of the team anymore. Everybody is a member of the team now. From the people that handles and sterilizes the equipment, to the people that are passing the instruments, the surgeon, the anesthesia person. It's all part of one team. And when it becomes important is when something bad happens. And how teams used to respond in the dark ages is they would almost panic. You know, hours of boredom, minutes of panic. If you figure out how to work as a coordinated team with a person who does take charge and is the leader, you have to learn how to do that. And you have to learn how to go through step A, B, C, and D in order to make the right diagnosis and give the patient the right treatment. And that's a big thing that CME has brought into our profession, is learning how to behave when it really counts how to operate as a functioning team to make sure that the right things get done. We even now bring things, you say the computer that tells you everything about patients and everything you need to know about medicine. We have those hanging on every anesthesia machine that has various and sundry critical incidents in the operating room that it helps you to learn how to respond to that and make sure nothing is overlooked. Sometimes you got the wrong diagnosis. It helps you to do that too. And you have to switch gears and do something else. So this is all part of CME that you undergo that I find to be one of the most important aspects of education for not only young physicians, but people that are older physicians and may practice, let's say, just neuroanesthesia most of the time, but they're on call at night and they need to know how to understand with someone who's a multiple trauma patient and all of those sorts of things. So critical, and people have to take it seriously.
Skip, any thoughts?
I would say that from the business of CME that John and Kevin talked about, I got to be a much better skier. It's the best schedule. You go to class from 7:30 to 9, and then you ski from 9:30 to 4, and then they show you interesting slides so that when you're asleep, you're not really missing the important stuff, because they turn out the lights and they give you a chocolate chip cookie and some hot chocolate or coffee, and you have to rest up for dinner. So that official CME was really good for my skiing. I'd say that I learned the most from my patients. They taught me much more about myself and about themselves, which I think made me a better counselor and a better co-manager, because the patients really manage themselves. If I get out of their way, they usually do quite well. I was lucky enough to have Doug Herr as a partner for a number of years before he went on to cardiology. Doug Herr is still one of the best internists I ever worked with, and I learned a tremendous amount of medicine just working and talking about patients with him. And then, like many of us, you learn from your mistakes, and I made more than my share. But I was so nervous about hurting someone, or through my lack of work, my lack of knowledge, that a patient would suffer from me. When I did make a mistake, I tried very hard not to make that same mistake another time. I tried to learn from that. And over the course of practice, that was overall probably the thing that kept me honest, if you will, or kept me motivated.
You know, I asked Bill this question the other day. I said, if you could put your finger on one innovation that's happened over your 50-year career that is the most startling to you, whether it's technological or diagnostic or pharmaceutical, whether in your specialty or not, that you might not have ever envisioned when you were first starting out, what would you think has been the most dramatic thing that's improved your ability to be a doctor? Bill?
Well, for me, it would be imaging. I mean, when I was a first-year intern at Rush in 1979, you know, we had X-ray, and then just across the street at Cook County Hospital, they got this CT scanner, and it was really a big deal. We occasionally were able to get patients on their CT scanner, but you know, when you think of in just the years that have elapsed since then, I mean, we've gone from CT to MRI to PET scans, and at the risk of overstating it, it's almost rendered the physical examination useless, in the sense that I mean, we can always get a picture inside. It creates other problems, of course, because you find all sorts of stuff you wish you didn't find and didn't have to work up, but which creates lots of anxiety for people. But at the same time, the explosion in imaging technology has really been the big change for me.
Kevin?
I would agree with Bill, actually, about imaging. It's not in my field. People in my field, particularly in the pharmaceutical part of it, talk about all the magnificent advances in understanding brain function and stuff. I'm unimpressed. I don't think it's as dramatic as they like to say, and it's nowhere near being ready for clinical prime time. I think psychiatry, it's a great place, but it's not in a terribly different place from where it was a few decades ago. Imaging is a whole different thing. You know, the idea that you could get a look at a cross-section of a patient's body without sawing the patient in half to have to do that is just astounding. And now that's absolutely routine. But I think it has made some problems, one of which is that our ability to gather information has vastly outstripped our ability to understand the significance of the information that we gather. So you put somebody in a scanner, you find all kinds of things, and you say, gee, that's interesting, no idea what it means or what we can do about it, but it sure is an interesting finding. I think we're going to be in that state for a long time.
John, primary care, things same thing? Or?
Well, yeah, I think the imaging, when I thought about this question, I was sure other people would mention imaging. So you also, in the question, asked what changed things for our patients. And how many, I'm just curious here, have seen a nurse practitioner or a PA instead of their doctor or a doctor? Right, so in 1985, I opened a clinic. I was part-time. It was really the nurse practitioner's clinic, and to serve a small community that was part of our network. So I looked up how many nurse practitioners there were in 1985, roughly, and there's like 15 or 20,000. They're now over 270,000. So throughout my career, PAs and nurse practitioners have been more and more involved with direct care of the patients, really in all specialties. It's not just internal medicine. So I think the whole complexion of how medicine is practiced has changed dramatically in the course of my experience. So.
Sal?
I think that in the anesthesia sphere, what's really made huge amounts of difference is ultrasound and brain monitoring. Ultrasound, because it's nice not to give people anesthesia gases or some other medicines if you can do it in a simpler fashion. If you can do a nerve block for your surgery and supplement that with a little bit of sedation. Ultrasound is kind of revolutionized the ability for people to safely do nerve blocks that are the basis for people's anesthetics. Now, certain things you can't do with nerve blocks, but lots of the peripheral stuff, lots of orthopedic procedures, some of the more complex plastic surgery reconstructive cases are done with that. And if you can image what you're seeing with ultrasound, it makes your placement of a needle so much safer to do. You're not injecting local anesthesia into blood vessels, which is not a really good thing to do. And it enables you to access parts of the body that ordinarily, unless you could see it, you shouldn't be sticking a needle there. So that's one of the things. And the other thing that's on a par with that is we're now at the point where we can look at what's happening in the brain in a very algorithmic way that shows you what areas of the brain might be affected, or if there's too much alpha waves versus too much delta waves, or this person is having flat lines, it's not having any waves at all. And in a particular patient, that will give you an idea of a lot of the things that are happening that you don't want to let persist. And I think in most young, healthy people, like all of us here, young, healthy people, it doesn't matter so much. But in people who are frail, people who have some cognitive dysfunction going in are at greater risk that you can start to perceive that something as bad is happening in their brain just by looking at the changes in alpha, delta waves, and fast waves, and high energy waves, and that sort of thing. That has made a huge difference in terms of patient safety. And that's what we're after in surgery and anesthesia.
Skip, any Star Wars things that you've just been amazed by in your career?
Oh, I think the list of amazing technological improvements, the things surgeons can do now the things interventional radiologists can do now to prevent the need for surgery, the imaging that allows that to happen is extraordinary. The main kind of impactful technological thing that affected my practice as a primary care doc was the intrusion of payers, government and insurance payers, into the relationship between myself and my patients. And I felt like most of my primary care practice and career was impacted by having to negotiate with third parties as opposed to a patient trusting in me and me trusting in the patient to coming up with the best solution. And the finance of medicine, as it impacted that, was something I felt I had to struggle against so that I would do the right thing for the patient, not the right thing for the insurance company or the payer. And that was something that was really pretty powerful in my practice, and particularly when I became a hospitalist, where I didn't have to think about that as much because I was now on a salary, and patients were sent to me by really good docs like John and Bill, and they had done all the hard work of figuring out what's wrong, and then they sent people to the hospital so that we could let the nurses do the good work of getting them better. And the finances were somebody else's problems. The hospital had to bill the patient or not, and lots of people got free care. The number of people who get free care, I mean, I'm amazed that the best thing about the medical system that I'm aware of is that once you get into it, docs and nurses take care of you, and it doesn't matter how much money you have. Everyone that I know of as a professional takes the best care they can of the patient, regardless of the paying. I was in Australia once, and I was talking to an X-ray technologist, as she called herself. She said, "Is it true that if there's a car accident, the ambulance drives up and they ask if the person has insurance, and if you don't have insurance, they don't take you for care?" I said, "No." But this was what someone in Australia thought the American system was about, that it was driven by the insurance. I didn't tell her not completely, but it was very powerful for me as part of my practice to have to manage and negotiate that.
I knew sooner or later the finance people, the lawyers, the insurance people would get dragged into this conversation. We got a little time left, and I want to leave some time for some questions. The last 30 months, COVID, a virus, has kind of dominated our lives and still dominating us a little bit. What's the one most important thing we've learned medically? Maybe not public policy or health care broadly, but medically, what's the most important insight you think we've gained from the COVID experience? Go back to you, Skip.
We don't know very much. We have an awful lot to learn, and we should stay very humble.
Sal?
I couldn't agree more. And something that 2 weeks ago was gospel no longer applies this week or next week. And I think that's part of the problem. It's such a complex thing medically, and it's hard to investigate everything about it that physiologically can cause you damage, that we sometimes are tentatively doing what we think is the right thing, and it might not be. That's what troubles me. It might not be. I must admit, I've had 2 shots and 2 booster shots. And I'm thinking I'm a pretty lucky guy that I haven't had some of the problems that one gets from getting an injection of these vaccinations. Because there are some pretty bad things that have happened to people. And that's scary.
Dr. Bill?
I think the one thing we haven't learned from COVID is humility. Holman Jenkins in the Wall Street Journal in March of 2020 made a statement that struck me at the time, and it keeps coming back to me. And he said, "There's so much about this disease that we don't know, and so much of what we know is wrong." And as we've gone through this whole process and seen science evolve over, real science evolve over these last 30 months. The science changes every day. You can find data that you want on to support any side of any argument you want to do. And in a world where, the guidance changes, almost by the day, if not by the hour, that's the problem with concierge medicine, by the way. We've gotten to a point where, friends are not friends with their friends anymore, and families are being broken up over disagreements over this stuff. And the fact is, no one knows anything about this stuff. And I think it's just hard to be very dogmatic about a lot of what we've seen evolve over these last 30 months.
Kevin?
Well, maybe this shades towards public policy, forgive me, but what I'm most struck by is the extent to which the spread and continuance of this pandemic has been a function of psychology and behavior rather than of medicine and virology. If people actually listened to the medical profession and did what we had advised, this would have been largely brought under control a year ago. But the people have their own ideas and they do their own things, and the outcome depends much more on that than it does on what we figure out in the laboratories.
John?
I can't quote the Wall Street Journal, but Rosanna Dana said, "It's always something." And if we've learned nothing, we've learned that we really were unprepared at a variety of different levels, whether it was in supply chains that weren't diverse because of the way hospitals negotiate their contracts, lack of knowledge, which I will confess to not having much background in managing pandemic type problems. It's not taught in medical school, although it probably will be in the future. And if you think right now, you're reading about monkeypox. Now, of course, that's not COVID. It's a very different virus. Its emergence may be related to eradication of the smallpox virus in 1980. It's always something. We have to be prepared, whether it's COVID, monkeypox, which it probably won't be, or something else.
Thanks, guys. All of us have a primary physician, and all of us go in and wait for that one big moment of important medical advice from our physician. And I have a slide here that seems to be a recurring theme. I pretty much get this once a year from Dr. Phillips, and it doesn't seem to help, but it's a recurring theme. And I just wanted to ask you guys, is there a thought you might offer to all of us as patients? What can we do to be better patients in our remaining years? I'll use years, decades, months, hopefully more than that. Dr. Bill.
Well, as I was saying yesterday, there's nothing I like more than a well-informed patient who asks good questions. A lot of these are generated by the internet, some of which gets somewhat annoying. It's particularly when you get the attitude that if I disagree with the internet, I must be wrong. And there's a way of asking the question that doesn't sound quite so bad. That would be my one piece of advice.
Skip?
I think the best way to deal with our modern medical system is to avoid needing it. And the simple thing that most of us don't do enough of is just mild to moderate exercise. Just walk 30 minutes, 5 times a week, and you'll avoid a huge percentage of the garbage that happens to all of us. Just, we have this amazing thing called the body, and both mentally and physically, walking 30 minutes a day is good for both halves of it. And I think to be the best patient you can be is to be the happiest, healthiest person you can be. And I think doing a little exercise is the way to get there.
Sal?
I think particularly appropriate for this day and age is a couple of things are really bad for patients. And I wish we could figure out ways to modify this in everyday practice or give people ideas on how to prevent anxiety, anger, are probably two of the things that can wreak havoc on your body and your brain and everything else. And to say, don't get angry, don't get anxious about things is very hard to do, and it's very hard for patients to control. But I do think that it leads to a lot of ills in our population as a whole. Stress, anxiety, all of that hurts.
So we should pipe into all clinics the song "Don't Worry, Be Happy"?
Well, that's why I don't know how to be able to do that. Maybe Kevin can.
Yeah, Kevin?
Well, you're right about the bad consequences of anger and anxiety and so forth, but on the other hand, it does keep people like me in business.
There's a bright side to everything.
That's the first good thing we've heard.
John?
Well, I asked my wife what I should say to answer this question. She immediately started to harangue me about my diet. So, other than the obvious, exercise, decent diet, avoid risk factors that you can, this is a little negative, and I'm not picking on Skip, but I think that being well informed is important, and if you are unfortunate enough to be hospitalized, there are now, compared to when we were first practicing, all sorts of transitions that occur in the hospital. And you need to be well informed, you need to advocate for yourself, and if you are really ill and you cannot, you need to have someone that can be an advocate for you. The hospital, in spite of everyone's best intentions, can be a difficult place. So,
you talk about physical health, and I think a lot of us think about cognitive health. There's that creeping thing about memory and getting old and not remembering things. I have a final slide that just might be everybody's nightmare.
I don't want to look.
See if you can find it.
you got us all looking.
Can't remember how to do it.
Need some help with that?
I can't find something.
Where are your keys?
So, if you find yourself asking your physician this question, I think it's over. It might also apply to golf balls on the golf course if you don't have good vision. We've got a few minutes left. I'd be happy to take a few questions of our physicians, and then we have a little something for them. Anybody have any questions of these guys?
I don't have a question, but I am an RN, and one thing that always amazes me is how patients try to clean up their diet and their physical being a week or two before they go to the doctor. So that their lab work comes out perfect. And I think that's like taking a finely tuned organ, and then it breaks down the next week and you bitch about the doctor. So that's kind of like, if you're in that same genre, how to be a better patient, is go in the way, if you're not living clean, just go in and let them diagnose you correctly so you can make these adjustments. So that's just my little bit.
I have patients who say they're too sick to call me. They want to wait till they're well, and then they'll dial me up.
Paula.
This is a diagnosis question. With primary care physicians being terribly overloaded these days, and the shortage even of specialty physicians and the growing specialization, trying to get a diagnosis of something that you don't pick up directly from a blood test or something seems to be getting incredibly difficult. You move from doctor to doctor, and it may be months in between, even with referrals. I'd be interested to hear what you think is a solution to that problem.
Bill, you're still practicing. Why don't you take that?
Get Bill's number.
Move to Chicago and hire Bill.
Yeah. No, it is a real problem. I mean, that's supposed to be what I do as a concierge doctor is to grease those skids and get the, but it makes me crazy that I've got a patient who I'm thinking they may have MS. I call the neurologist and they say, yeah, we can get him in November. Well, I just don't think she wants to sit on that diagnosis for 6 months. Well, I don't know. Even when I had 3,500 patients, I could always find 5 or 10 minutes. And people have just gotten so rigid in their schedules, it's impossible to get these people into the specialties they need. But I mean, it can be done, but it takes a lot of phone calls. I wish I had a better answer for you.
Let's take one more here. Ernie?
So, do I take from that question and answer that we have sort of a shortage of physicians in this country? And if that's the case, why do medical schools continue to limit the number of people that they'll graduate?
We're trying to stay away from finance. And not that, politics and...
That's the answer. That's a cold, merciless, not caring answer from your profession.
Some of the residents that are going into practice now have debt that's $200,000 to $300,000 that they have to deal with. So it may be cold and it may be wrong, but it's real.
Maybe that PA issue is one of the ways to go with that.
Well, I was just going to say, because it's my understanding that more and more graduates of medical schools are choosing specialties or subspecialties to go into, and so fewer and fewer primary care people are coming out. I mean, I really think the future of I'm a dying breed. I think the future of primary care and internal medicine is going to be nurse practitioners and medical assistants doing that kind of work.
Skip?
That's why we have 210,000 of them today.
Yeah.
Because of that.
Yeah.
Well, maybe instead of reacting the way I did, I should have followed up and said, well, why don't we have more medical schools? Maybe if we had more medical schools and a little more competition, it wouldn't be quite so expensive to go to them. How about that? Is there a limit on the number of medical schools in this country? I think there is.
I think my take on that, I think the most recent medical schools that have started up, the cost involved in starting a medical school, staffing it with faculty, getting the imaging mechanisms, et cetera, is just amazing. I think you can also say, if you step back, and I'm not an economist, but I think this is a question for economists, is that there's a will. If the United States of America wanted to have enough physicians to take care of everybody, we could do it. We might have to have a few less bombers, but the money is there if the political will is there. I think that the same thing about education. We were teasing not talking about universal health care, but that's a political, economic decision. That's not a medical decision for how much is available. And I think partly there's a lot of there are physical limitations, there are some financial limitations, but I think mostly there's a moral lack of will to solve the problem. I think we could solve it, but we haven't gotten there. We're not mature enough yet to do so.
Ernie, there's one other thing that's going on now. There are more foreign medical graduates when you're talking about not creating new medical schools. These are bright people, and I again looked this up before this talk. About 25% of the physician workforce today is Yes, right.
Close enough.
Okay. Made up of foreign medical graduates. So there's another resource.
Do they stay here or do they go back home?
I can only speak from, our residency, but most stay, very much want to stay. There are visa issues and so forth and so on. Occasionally they'll go home and work in a medical school.
We're gonna wrap this up because people have other activities to go to. But let's thank our docs for sit tight. We have a little something for you. I think we got one last guy here's got a problem he wants to talk about. That's right. Yeah. So what happened? I told you this was a panel. It wasn't a doctor visit, Reg.
Dr. Sal, don't turn the man.
Don't turn around.
I want you to take care of me, man. Okay. Bend over. Kevin, I need you like a more than a...
Hey, thank you.
Nice go. Let's have a round of applause for our flag. Yeah. Look at that. Could you do something about those gowns?
That's a public health dilemma.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. We'll see you tonight at dinner.